Hi, my name's Ian Kinder. I'm with a school called Live Safe Academy. If you like this video, this podcast, and you think it's helpful, you can help us help other people. Go to Live Safe Academy /connect, where you will have access to our podcast, our articles, our videos. You can subscribe to our email list, and you'll have access to our live virtual classes that you can participate from anywhere in the world. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and share the video with others. If you're listening to this through a podcast, please subscribe to this podcast and share it with others. And I'm very excited today to introduce Lou Chiodo, one of the few men that I call teacher. And we're here to talk about a very important topic, and that's a shooting method called target focused shooting. Lou is an innovator in these methods. He's a proponent in these methods. These methods have a long and deep historical tradition and a proven track record of success over a very long period of time under very real and difficult conditions. So Lou, if you can you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us a little bit about your tactical tips series, a little bit about your background, and then let's jump into the topic of this video and podcast, which is target focused shooting methods.
Sure. Well, good morning, Ian, and everybody that's watching. Uh, my tactical tip of the week began back a couple of years ago. And what I wanted to do is take topics that are of interest to anybody that is into combat shooting, self-defense, integrating both of them together, and have some thought on topics that relate to that entire topic of self-defense. Some of it is more technical than others. Some of it deals with mindset issues. But as you mentioned today, we'll be talking in a short while here about a real important element of combat shooting, which is target focused shooting. And I'll explain more about that here in a short bit. My background in teaching this started, back decades ago, actually. Prior to even getting involved in law enforcement, I was introduced to these methods of shooting by combat veterans of World War II and the Korean War back in the early 70s. Then I developed this further for my agency and changing the entire programs that we were using for both the handguns and long gun training. It's a method that we use for close quartered shooting. So what we'll be discussing this morning is some elements of that and why it's such a critical thing for our training.
Well, if anybody has an interest in reading your tactical tips, and I highly recommend them, in the show notes, there's going to be a direct link to your tactical tip so they can read along with the different topic that we're discussing here. But can you tell me and tell the listeners and the viewers a little bit about your background and a little bit about your background as it relates to these methods and how you've been an innovator in bringing these methods to both law enforcement and the public?
Oh, sure. Well, I began martial arts training very early on in life when I was about 9 years old. That's now 57 years ago. That led me through learning how to use my mind and body together, normal things that you would associate with martial arts training, the physical end of it. But what it did is, as I progressed through it, it taught me how to actually piece together training, how to get people through a program of instruction so that we begin at zero and end up exactly where we want at the end with them understanding and being able to apply that training. I did this all the way through my high school years, and in college I got picked up and accepted into a Marine Corps commissioning program. I spent 10 years commissioning service, commissioned service in the Marine Corps. I attained the rank of captain in the regular Marine Corps. And then at that point, I decided to make a career change, and I was accepted into the California Highway Patrol. I spent 23 years there. I worked graveyard for 23 years, but intermingled with all that was my participation in both defensive tactics and also our weapons training programs. I was able to develop this target focused shooting method to the point where I was able to not only train the people in my area office, about 90 troopers, brought it to my division, which was about 1,200 troopers, but I was able to completely change the entire program for our department statewide. And that was at the time about 7,000 of us, spread out all over the state of California in 100 different area offices. So I've had a lot of experience in developing not only the programs, but implementing it, teaching it to people. And of course, my company, Gunfighters Limited, I started that in 2001. And that kind of brought me more into the civilian community also, because then I started teaching not only within the law enforcement community, but also within the concealed weapons community, which was more civilians. So, I've run the gamut of training this system. And frankly, the neat thing about it is the people who have survived gunfights utilizing this. One thing that I had that was probably unique was an agency that was out in the field doing it. And of course, in modern law enforcement, we get in gunfights. So I was able to track how we were training, what we were training, and be able to bounce that off of what was happening actually in the live gunfights. So I was able to correlate all that to know that what I was teaching was actually working where it needed to work. That was in combat.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds because we're trainers and we love this kind of stuff. But I do want to point out an observation that I think is really important and that I want other people to pay attention to when they're evaluating different shooting methods. If you look at some of the historical figures that were proponent of these methods, W.E. Fairbairn, Sykes, Applegate, what they all had in common was that they were developing these methods and applying them directly in real environments, and that they weren't just applying the methods themselves, because as individuals, some people may just be more gifted than others, so they can maybe be more successful with the type of method than others. But they have experience training other people in those methods and having them go out and apply those under real conditions. And I think that trio of applying those methods under real conditions and training other people to apply those methods under real conditions, and the fact that the people who are getting the training, these aren't necessarily like people that get a lot of training all the time, but just have a baseline level of training, but are still successful with these methods. And that's important because most people who train, whether it's for the military, law enforcement, or private sector, they really don't have a lot of time to train. They really don't have a lot of training. So with the little bit of training time that you have, we have to really be able to make a difference. And so I think that real world application that you have, that real world experience of not only applying those methods in the field, but training other people to apply those methods in the field, and then getting that real world feedback, that is just an incredible vetting method to separate theory from reality.
Well, sure. And, in regard to now talking directly about the target focused shooting system, I want to read out of my book a statement that I developed. And this statement was designed to show what the overall program is all about. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this, and then we'll discuss some elements and how it applies to the topic. It reads as follows. The purpose of firearms training is to prepare a person to use firearms in a fight against an adversary in what usually begins as a spontaneous attack initiated by the adversary. A firearms program is not about shooting, it is about fighting. When the concept of fighting is taken out of firearms training, we have forgotten the purpose of our training. And I think this is a critical statement, because often things that people train don't necessarily apply to the environment that they're going to use it in. They're being asked to do things that maybe won't be possible under the conditions in which they have to actually apply it. So what we try to do with the overall program is implant things that are going to work for them, probably at the worst time in their life. That's when they're having a fight for their life. There's plenty of people that go out and do shooting things. There's really neat things to do in shooting. You can shoot matches. You can go, practice at the range. You can do all these type of things. However, sometimes those things don't really jibe with what's happening to people in live incidents. where there's a two-way range in which we have live rounds coming down range on us. And whatever we attempt to do there has to work against a person that's trying to fight us, not just a piece of paper and cardboard down range. So we try to, in all the things we do in training, link reality to the methodology that we teach.
You know, and Bruce Lee has a quote that I love that I know you love: boards don't hit back. And Mike Tyson said something similar. Everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the face. But just for the people who are listening or watching this video, if you think about a lot of really fancy kind of acrobatic martial arts moves and go, wow, that looks really cool. And then you put that person on a prison yard and they get knocked out by a prisoner with a single punch. And, you know, it looks really great in training, but it doesn't necessarily translate to real violence. And a lot of people, they go to the range, they put up their paper target, they take their time, they zero in on their sights, they work their trigger, they control their breathing, and then they come away and go, wow, I'm really good at shooting. I'm like a surgeon. But the reality is all of those things that you're doing when you're shooting at paper are not things that you can do when you have to fight for your life. We have to have skills that make us effective when we're fighting for our life. Lou, people can download your book free on your website as a PDF. What's the title of your book?
It is winning a high-speed, close-distance gunfight. And all they have to do is log on to my website and they can download it and have all that information. Paladin Press was initially publishing it, but when they went out of business and stopped publishing books, it gave me back the rights to the book. And I decided at that point that I want everybody that's interested to be able to get it for free. So I put it up there in the website.
What is your website, sir?
It's Gunfighters Limited, all one word, gunfightersltd.com. And that'll take you right there.
Great. Thank you very much. And right from there, they can download your book. They can read it for free, own that PDF copy, in addition to reading your articles, tactical tips. So if you look at these target focused shooting methods, of course, the elements of target focused shooting come from, these elements that apply to all human combat. So they've been around for as long as violence has been around. I think we can trace the actual methods in writing back to World War I. We can definitely link them back to the 20s and the 30s. So the question that brings up is, if they've been around for that long, well, then they must be old and they don't work now, right?
Well, that would be a mistake for anybody to actually believe that. We have to, I guess, ask the first question is, what is target focused shooting? Well, one thing that I discussed directly with Colonel Applegate, who was my mentor, was the terminology of point shooting. And that was a terminology that they used. Fairburn in the early days used it as instinctive shooting. I decided to stay away from those particular words because it means different things to different people. When I talk about what is target focused shooting, what it means is it's a method of aiming your handgun at the threat by keeping your visual contact on the threat and not moving it off. So that when someone is engaged in a close quartered fight, they're able to keep their vision on the threat so that they can see what the threat is actually doing, but they can still, based on the way that we teach the system, accurately engage the threat with multiple rounds, controlling the weapon, but still being able to maintain combat accuracy. And I think this is a critical point that sometimes can get overlooked in regards to the way that a lot of people have been trained to shoot. When we talked a couple of minutes ago where I read that statement, well, the primary purpose of target focused shooting is for close quartered combat. And generally we'll say maybe 0 to 5 yards, 0 to 7 yards, well within that range limit, where the vast majority of all gunfights occur anyways. And it's designed to be used at a time where your response has to be very rapid. It's very difficult at those times when someone else starts a spontaneous attack to you, whether it's shooting at you, whether it is coming down on you with a knife or other edge type weapon, some kind of impact weapon where they may be closing distance. It's very difficult for people at that time to take their eyes physically off the threat, because your eyes are giving your brain information about what you need to do in regards to addressing that threat. So in those really compressed time limits, a lot of the conventional training methods that people do basically fail them. And we know this through a couple of ways. One, we know it through doing a lot of simulated training and debriefing people in scenario-based training as to what they were able to apply in their training. These are people that were trained both in sighted shooting, meaning, the classic come back on your front sight, target becomes a blur, breathe, relax, aim, slack, squeeze, all these things that we get taught in a lot of the conventional training methods. When we're debriefing and we're finding out that that's not what they did. But when we've trained them in target focused shooting, we can see the results of where in simulated training, where either the BBs that we use in airsoft or whether we're using some kind of a simunition system, we can see the hits on target, and then we can debrief and find out exactly what they perceived of the threat, where their eyes were focused, so we can get a correlation to the methodology that we're teaching. So, we're not saying people are going to go 50 yards out or 25 or 30 yards out, whatever long range you want to apply to this, and that's a method that are going to get them a hit. Although we do teach a way of using the sight system with target focus that works out to those intermediate ranges that work perfectly. Because that's where we, when you think about it, pretty much every fight you're going to get into with a handgun is going to be somewhere between 0 yard or contact at 0 point out to maybe 15 yards. So, this is where we want this system to be applied, and we want it to be part of someone's training so that when they default back to it, because they can't get their eyes off the threat, they have to have a trained response to get the rounds on target. That's what target focused shooting can do for them. And we've got a lot of live combat shoots because of the nature of the people that I've trained with this. We get a lot of direct feedback when real bullets are in the air. And it all comes back to the point where this being in their training allows them to be able to get success in fights.
I think that's a really key point that people need to hear. The way I explain to my students is humans are rational animals. We survive by information. So the brain is desperately seeking whatever information it can get to make whatever decision it needs to protect the individual's safety. And vision is normally the primary source of information. So the brain is going to fixate the eyes on whatever problem the brain is trying to solve. And that's the difference between conventional training, where you're using your sights or optics or a laser to aim your gun, versus a real situation where your brain is forcing your eyes to look at the problem that you're trying to solve. So training can give you a false validation. That's one issue. But the other issue is if we know our brain is going to fixate our eyes on the problem that we're trying to solve, we need to have training methods that will give us hits on target under that circumstance. If all you have is I look at my sights, I look at my optics, I look for a red dot laser, then if your brain's not doing that at that critical moment of life and death, then that training is not going to help you. Now, and I know you're a big proponent of this, and I am too. It's not a this versus that. We want to have the full spectrum of training. We want to be able to use optics. We want to be able to use our sights. We want to be able to use a laser if that's a system that we have on our gun, because those things can be advantageous in some situations. But probabilities dictates priorities. And in most cases, the brain is going to focus the eyes on the problem. So we need to have methods that accommodate those circumstances too. And the comparison that I like to make is you look at rifle shooting when they're shooting for precision at a distance. There's a lot of things that they have to do. They've got to line up their sights, they got to coordinate their breathing, they've got to have good trigger discipline, because they've got to be able to get shots on a target at a long distance, and that requires a lot of precision. But if you look at a shotgun shooter who's going to shoot at a bird breaking a tree line, and the bird's going to be gone like that, he's got to very quickly be able to point that gun, make sure that barrel's aligned with his eye, and break that shot before that bird gets away. We want to have that full spectrum, but we also need to understand that most shootings are going to be more like that shotgunner trying to quickly break that shot on that bird before it disappears, not like that rifle shooter who needs to take time and be very precise to get that accurate shot at that distance target.
Well, exactly. And, one of the things that we could discuss very briefly is origins of this. W.E. Fairburn was probably the first person that did real active studies about how people were really responding in live combat shoots. He was handed a problem, which was their guys were getting killed. Well, he had to come up with a study to say, well, what are we doing? What are we doing in our training that is relating to the environment where these guys are getting killed? So back then they were doing a lot of the very strict sighted shooting, very slow, deliberate shooting, more of what you would, excuse me, more of what you would see in, a target-oriented program, just target shooting. Well, he found out that that wasn't working because that wasn't happening. So he started to experiment with not training in those methods, but the early stages of what would now evolve into target-focused shooting. And again, they called it instinctive shooting, because they were finding that most of their shootings were in close quarters. They were in bad lighting conditions. They were spontaneous in nature, meaning the bad guys started shooting first, and they had their training was failing them. So he reoriented training, and then they started winning. Colonel Applegate hooked up with him during World War II. Colonel Applegate took these methods and brought it into the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. They went into combat with this stuff. Different units trained in this method, and they were having success. Later on, I am very humbled that Colonel Applegate is a mentor of mine, and I was able to expand on the things that they developed, bring it into modern law enforcement training, and be able to bounce the things that I was doing that was either augmentation of what they did or taking certain things in a little bit different direction. I could bounce it right off of Colonel Applegate, and everything I did basically met with his approval. So when all this stuff went online, it went online with years and years of development and experience well beyond mine, because this went back into the 1920s. So that's kind of a brief way of explaining where it brought me. Now, one of the things that you mentioned is about, vision and the eyes getting sucked in downrange onto these threats. Well, a lot of research has been done in seeing how the sympathetic nervous system causes different reactions in our mind and body. And these things that happen to us affect the way we're going to shoot. Our vision gets affected, a lot of it, when the sympathetic nervous system narrows our vision. So we lose a lot of our peripheral vision because of, we call it tunnel vision, but it's really peripheral narrowing, where everything comes into this ball in front of us. Now, most people have had things that have happened to us, even if they haven't been in a shooting or haven't been in those type of incidents. They've had some kind of thing happen to them that brought the world and shrunk it into a little ball right into their vision. And at that moment, you could have probably never have done anything to get their vision off of what was downrange of them or in front of them, because that's the way that the sympathetic nervous system works. Even if it's a non-combat related thing, it will still do it in other scenarios. Your blood is getting transferred to different parts of your body. The major muscles of your body, your thighs, your shoulders, your forearms, all these things that we use to fight with get amplified by all this blood being taken to them. It's taking blood away from your vision. This is why sometimes, people who say that their vision wasn't quite right when they're in these incidents. Um, that's something that you have to account for. One of the things that I learned through sports optometrist was this, it's a term called hyperactive optical shift. And what that means is that when your eyes are focused downrange on a specific thing, it's going to take a certain amount of time, even under normal conditions, for it to refocus at a closer range to you. So the implications there for shooting is if my eyes are glued down range, trying to then bring that focus back onto my front sight when this has all happened, for many people can become a very bad issue, because now maybe the training that they've done is now not going to be available to them. And if they haven't trained for target focus shooting, they may be at a loss because what they've been training isn't working where they are. And that's where we get training failures, and that's where we can get people getting hurt. So these things all have to be considered in your training. Now, obviously, this isn't a how-to course here. We're discussing this issue. We're going to be running a virtual class that's going to get into the how-to, and Ian will have information for that later on. But these are all the considerations that go into why we use target focused shooting. The other reasons why we need to be able to do this is many of these shootings happen in dim light or very diminished lighting conditions, to where sometimes the use of sights may become an issue. So you have to have something to fall back on that's going to work in those diminished lighting conditions that are going to allow you in those close quarters room combat distances to be able to hit what you're shooting at. The other thing that happens is people move. Both the shooter might be moving, the suspect might be moving, both of you might be moving at the same time. Now, I know most people reading this are pretty reasonable people, but it would kind of be difficult to focus on an eighth of an inch at the end of your barrel. When you're trying to track the movement of a suspect, you're moving at the same time, and then you're trying to get your eyes back on that to be able to say that you're lined up. Well, the problem is if the person's moving, then where are you going to be shooting? Even if you could get away with doing that, you're going to be shooting somewhere other than where they are. Just like where you mentioned about bird hunting. If I've done a lot of bird hunting. If you take your eyes off the bird and try to come back to the top of your shotgun, it's over. You've lost contact with the target, meaning that bird. And wherever you're going to shoot in, it's just not going to be where they are. So this is an important consideration. So, when you add all of this in, as you mentioned, yes, we're going to learn how to use sights with our guns. We're going to learn how to be precise with them when we need to be. But then we also need to be able to use that weapon system in scenarios where that might not be available to us. It's just like, again, we're both martial artists and people that teach defensive tactics to people. Well, I'm not going to get someone that they're face to face with someone and tell them it's legitimate to try to use a roundhouse kick on them. Because the only thing that's going to happen is they're going to take their foot off the ground and end up on their back because it's inappropriate. So we teach them other things to do in those environments. We teach them to use palm strikes. We teach them to attack the eyes. We teach them how to use their knees and their elbows because those are more legitimate for the environment they're going to be fighting in. We're not going to tell them to do things that aren't going to work. It's the same thing here. Through the experience, and not only teaching it through personal experience, the experience of dozens of other people have been in close quartered gunfights, we know that certain things just didn't work for them. And yeah, you might get the rare person out there that says, yeah, I was able to do X, Y, and Z. Well, you can't build a whole program off of a couple of people, or you can't build a program off someone that has so much experience with violence or gunfighting that they maybe are in a little bit different category of shooter. So this is what we need to do to kind of round out our training. And that's pretty much where we are with target focus shooting.
Yeah, and I think you said a lot of really important things. I just want to point out to the people who are listening and watching this that if you talk to people, when you interview people, either after force on force training or after they've been in real shootings, a lot of times they don't even see the gun. And I know with different departments and things that we worked with where they're kind of like, like that, right? And then they have a shooting and you look at the video, if there's video that's available, and you can see the officer's eye line is here and the gun line is down here. And well, they're obviously not looking at the gun, they're looking at the problem that they're trying to solve. But these issues don't come out in conventional shooting a target, paper targets or steel targets. So again, people get this false sense of validation, but these are things that we know happen for real. And therefore, there are things that people need to train for to be truly prepared. But the nice thing is it's not of this versus that. I always ask students, I go, hey, if you're going to build a house, what's more important, a saw or a hammer? Well, it depends on what you're doing, right? But what we know for sure is we don't saw with hammers and we don't hammer with saws. We need to use the right tool for the right job, but we need both tools. We're not talking about this versus that. We're just trying to round out people's training so that they're truly prepared for the situations that they're likely to be in. But the last thing I'm going to say here, and then I'm going to throw it back at you, Lou, which is that probabilities dictates priorities. So yes, we need to have both, but we need to start with and focus on the things that are most likely. And what's going to happen in most shootings for most people is that the brain is going to fixate the eyes on the problem that they're trying to solve. It will not be looking at the gun. So we need to be prepared for that in our training. We have an ethical responsibility and a practical need to be able to get shots on the bad guy, and that's what this training is for. Lou, I want to give you a chance to finish off with any topics that you want to cover about the methods of target focus shooting, but then I want to go into another topic, which is the live virtual training, because another kind of challenge that we face as trainers is getting people to understand the value of live virtual training for combat shooting skills. And it's kind of funny, we were talking about this earlier, that you, me, Joe Ferrera, who's another one of those few men that I call teacher, we're always fighting trends, right? Like target focused shooting was against the grain because most conventional shooting is learning how to use your sights or optics or a laser. Using airsoft as a training method is something that for many, many years, people didn't see the value in. Force on force training is not a conventional means of training. Although I think, people see the obvious value in that. It's not a conventional training method. And then now here we are into these, live virtual training courses, and people are like, you can't use live virtual training for combat skills. You got to be there in person. And clearly in-person training is irreplaceable. There's a lot of benefit you get from being there with the instructor and working together. But there's a tremendous amount of value that you get from live virtual training, which also has a lot of tremendous benefits, like being extremely cost effective, being extremely time effective, but also allowing us to focus on things that we might not be able to focus on in in-person training that can really help improve somebody's level of preparation and skill level. So I want to give the ball to you, but before we go into the live virtual training, is there anything you want to finish off with the methods of target focus shooting?
Sure. Well, you kind of highlighted one of the points, which was force on force training. And, for me, it takes two different kind of tracks. We use set drilling, which is force on force, to where role players know what they're going to do. The person knows what's going to happen there, but they get to apply the training against a person doing specific things. It's drilling. We do the same thing in martial arts where we're teaching how to integrate different things. We'll have one person, they may throw a punch and it requires the other person to coordinate some kind of response. That's drilling. But then we have scenario training where, basically other than the role player, the person that has to respond knows nothing about what's going on there, but they have to apply their training. What we do with target focused shooting and why this is so important is that we use the platform of doing these drills and then the scenarios to allow people to go into an environment where they have to apply the things that they've been training. And the sad thing is in many people's training regime, they never get a chance to do that. They'll spend years going to the range. They'll spend years, putting targets down range and working their precision shooting techniques, calling that combat shooting. But they never get a chance to work it against another person in an environment where we can create a two-way range where they have to actually apply what they do. So in a sense, they never really get to test anything. It would be the same as, for us martial artists or for boxers, just hitting a heavy bag, and all you ever done is hit a heavy bag. Then you walk out into the worst case scenario street fight that you're going to get into. And that's the first time that you try to apply what you're training. What's going to happen there? So we need this median to go from teaching methodologies, and that methodology should be the one that's going to work for the environment that you're in. Meaning, if I don't teach people how to shoot in close quarters and I start throwing them into close quartered scenario training, I wouldn't expect them to do too well because they maybe haven't really developed a methodology that works there. So we use the drilling in force on force and the scenarios so that people can iron out what they've been doing in training to actually applying it. And that's where it all meets. So that when they do get in a live combat shoot, as close as we can bring them there, we bring them. And there's people that I've actually interviewed that have told me that their live combat shoot felt easier than the training thing that they did. Because it was a very straightforward, very simple thing they did in the actual combat shooting that sometimes didn't have some of the complications that are brought into the scenario. In other words, it was just a quick boom. Suspect, was doing what they were doing. They drew their gun, they shot immediately, and it was done. Whereas there was no other complications involved in it. So, to sum it up, the purpose of doing this target focused shooting, and then of course taking it into an actual teaching of the methodology, is to give someone a tool to use in the environment where they may have to use it. And that's the bottom line to all our training. If we're not training for the environment where we're taking our training into, we're wasting our time. And I say that in all sincerity, because if you're wasting your time training things that don't work, you're not training the things that do work. So when you get into it for real, what would you expect to really be there? And that's the bottom line to what we try to do in all the training programs, is give people things that work. So I'll turn it back to you, but that to me is very important points for me to make for anybody viewing this.
Well, again, I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but I will point out something that people often say: you don't really know what you're going to do until you're in the situation, which is 100% true. But the nice thing about force on force training is the more realistic you can make it, the more you're able to draw out those responses to see how people are really going to react. And what's nice about that is in training, you have a learning curve. If you do something wrong, you can fix it. Where in a real situation, there might not be a learning curve because you live or die by the choices that you make. So I know even for myself personally, when protecting people, we would put ourselves into scenarios and you do some boneheaded, like, why did I do that? Right? Like totally just not something that you would do if you were thinking about it. But in the moment, you caught yourself making that mistake. So then you fix it in training. And it was funny. One day we did we had a training day where we did a lot of force on force training. The very next day, I was protecting somebody, and two of the scenarios that we trained the day before actually happened while I was protecting this person. But I was able to make the right decisions because when I made a mistake in training, I was immediately aware that it was a mistake. I immediately knew how to fix it. And then when I was in that real situation, I was much better prepared to respond in a way that was effective. That came directly out of force on force training. And that's just, one of countless examples. But the point is, we can draw out these unexpected responses, and then if they're counterproductive, we can fix them so that when we're in the situation, we have a better chance of an effective response, because you have that training curve there. You want to draw it out in training, and then you want to fix it. And it's not just technical stuff. It can be mindset stuff too. I have students freeze in training. Well, we can fix that in training. So you can fix that in a real situation. You're just stuck with the consequences. But let's talk about this live virtual training, Lou. So I'm telling you, you can't learn self-defense skills in live virtual training. You have to be there in person. So you prove that I'm wrong.
Oh, sure. Well, all training starts with learning mechanics of what you're going to do. Um, in the virtual class that we're going to start on Sunday, we're going to cover portions, the first 4 steps of a 7-step process that I developed to teach this target focus system. In essence, it's the same thing that we taught within the department training. It's the same 7-step process that I've taught in hundreds of classes that I've taught in my business. And what we're going to be doing there is covering the mechanics of it. We can use, depending on the person's ability to have available an airsoft gun. They may have one of these laser systems that they can use, or if they have neither one of those two, we're going to teach them how to be able to develop this system in dry firing, which is a little bit different way of dry firing than you would in conventional dry firing that most people do, where they come back on the sights and they're really slowly going through the trigger, all of those things. We'll teach them how to apply that dry firing to the program that we're going to do. So what in essence I will be doing is you would be seeing and hearing exactly the same thing that you would see and hear if I was standing there in a class like you hosted, dozens of times, in your state, where I was physically present. And then we're going to work drills within the context of the program, and then provide you with drills that we want you to use in between the second, third, and fourth class to go to the range and put rounds down range using the things that we taught in the mechanical part of this. And then next time you come in, if there's questions, you can ask questions about what you experience, and if there was any issues, we could settle them there and provide more information. But you can learn the mechanics virtually just the same as if you were there in person. The only thing that we don't have is that live range with us, but we will provide you with a schedule that you need to follow when you do go to the range to be able to work the drills live fire. And again, we're focusing on that 3 to 5 yard line, right in there where virtually all of these type of incidents happens. And we'll work through all the mechanics that you need to be able to integrate target focus shooting into your program.
So listening to you explain the methods, practicing the methods while you're explaining the methods, going through the exercises, that's literally identical to an in-person class, even to the point where we can see you and give corrective feedback, just like we would if we were standing there. That's literally identical as to a traditional in-person class. But here's something else I think is a really big deal, in that they're not just learning the methods, they're learning how to develop those methods. That's not only empowering them with skills that they can use to save their life, but it's empowering them with the ability to develop those skills on and off the range, so that if the country's shut down, if the ranges are closed, if ammunition is not available, there's a lot you can't do on commercial ranges. You can learn how to develop those skills at home through dry fire, through airsoft, through laser training systems, without the cost of ammo or without the dependency of going to a commercial range. And it really is the best of both worlds. And you made a comment a couple of times about people going to the range in between classes. Don't worry, if you don't have a range that's available, or you can't purchase ammo, or ammunition's too expensive, you can still practice these airsoft, dry fire, or through laser training systems. And then when that time comes that you can go to the range, then you'll have the ability to practice it when that becomes an available option. And you need to practice these live fire for sure. but there's so many other ways that you can develop these skills to contribute to that total package of preparedness, most of which can be done off the range through dry fire, through airsoft, through laser training systems. So we had this ability to not only teach methods, but to teach you how to develop these methods without being dependent on the supply of ammunition and without being dependent on the availability of a range. Those things should be integrated when available and possible, but you don't need them for that day-to-day skill development that should be a part of all of our training. And I say day to day, but I mean when everybody has their own training routine that they follow or should follow, where even if you only train once a month on these methods, you would be ahead of the vast majority of the people out there, because most people don't practice once a month. Most people practice a couple times in their life, and then that's it. So I think that's a really powerful thing. And again, whether you're standing there in person or not, they're still listening to you explain everything. They're still going through the exercises with you. We still have the ability to watch them as they're performing the physical skills. And they're learning how to develop these skills both on and off the range, both with live fire and using airsoft, dry fire, and laser training systems. And just like an in-person class, unlike a video where they're just purchasing a pre-recorded video, they actually get to interact with you and ask questions. And you brought this up when we were talking before the video, but it's so funny to me how people would, as an example, for years, they would say airsoft training isn't real training, but they were proponents of dry fire training. Well, airsoft training is everything dry fire training is, but with a projectile. It's just not logical. Now we look at people for a very long time have paid for pre-recorded videos that they can learn from. Well, with live virtual training, you're getting all the benefits of a pre-recorded video, but you're getting the added benefit of interacting with the instructor like you would if they were there in person. That right there is invaluable. That's all the difference in the world, that you can look at me, critique me, and I can ask you questions. That's an amazing benefit, all from the convenience of our own home. We don't have to travel somewhere. We can just take it right from the convenience of our own home. And that's so much more cost effective and so much more time effective than having to physically go somewhere to learn. Not that in-person classes are not extremely valuable, they are. And not that people shouldn't take in-person classes. Live virtual classes do not replace in-person classes, but they add something to training that is really unique and beneficial, that really augments other type of training methods, and in a way that is so convenient and so efficient. I'm really in love with this technology, and we've gotten so much positive feedback from our own Live Safe Academy live virtual program, students that will give reviews and go, I can't believe I learned so much. I can't believe this was such a beneficial experience. Because we have this prejudice against live virtual classes in regard to combat skills. And I'll say this, people have been kind of forced into online learning for schools or for business conferences. And they're like, man, I just don't like it. I get that. But this live virtual training experience for combat training, this is something that people have been very happy with and been very enthusiastic about, and very impressed and amazed by how much benefit they get and how much they enjoy the experience. So I'm going to stop talking because I can go forever, but let's wrap this up. Any last thoughts that you have, Lou? And then let's thank the viewers and the listeners for being a part of this experience with us, and we'll end the podcast, the video.
Sure. Well, I'd like to thank everybody that's listening. What I would really like to do is to be able to train with you. I think it's a unique opportunity to be able to just get on a computer, no matter where you are, no matter what the weather is, no matter what else is going on, to be able to present this program to you and give you a tool that you can practice from now to whenever, that will be very beneficial if you have to use your weapon system in some sort of close quartered fight. So I would look forward to wanting to train with you. It'll be beneficial, I think, for you to add to whatever other training that you're doing. And I hope to see you in one of the virtual classes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And these training classes are for people who are very new to guns. Like maybe they just got their concealed pistol license, they're fresh out of the academy, they're fresh out of their basic training, and they want to learn more. But these are also for very experienced shooters who want to learn more about these specific type of methods. It's a win-win for everybody. And for those of you who are listening and watching, remember, you can help us help you and help us help others by subscribing to this podcast and this video and sharing it with other people. You can also go to livesafeacademy.com/connect, where you'll have access to our podcast, our videos, our articles, our live virtual classes that you can participate from anywhere in the world, and join our email list. Guys, thank you so much. I hope everybody has a wonderful day and stay safe.